The knock came just after midnight, 3 hard raps against a door that had not been touched by a visitor in over a year, and my hand froze on the second candle before I could light it. I did not move at first. Nobody visits me anymore. Not since the search parties folded their maps and told me, with soft voices and tired eyes, that there was nothing left to search for. Not since the neighbors stopped looking at me when I passed, because grief that does not end makes people uncomfortable, and mine had stopped ending a long time ago. The knock came again, harder this time, and I heard a voice behind it, low and rough, speaking my name. Valeth Sorn. Nobody outside my old street knew that name anymore. I set down the candle, wiped my hands on my robe, and walked to the door with my heart doing something it had not done in a long while. It was beating like it still expected something to happen. I opened the door to find a stranger standing in the rain, and he did not look like someone who brought good news. He looked like someone who had walked through fire to get here. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that had not seen a proper shave in days, and eyes that carried the kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. His coat was torn at one sleeve, and there was a dark stain across his ribs that might have been mud or might have been something worse. He held one hand loosely against his side, as if it hurt to breathe too deeply. I do not see many humans where I live. My people keep to the outer settlements, far from the busy trade lanes where humans have made their name known across 100 systems, a name that is spoken with equal parts respect and caution. They are said to be reckless. They are said to be dangerous when provoked. They are also said, quietly, in ways nobody likes to admit out loud, to be the kind of people who do not know how to leave a debt unpaid. I did not know, standing in that doorway, which kind of human I was looking at. "Are you Valeth Sorn?" he asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, like he had said very little in the past few hours, and his throat had forgotten how. "I am," I said. "Who is asking?" He did not answer right away. He looked past me, into the small house I had built out of grief and habit, at the 2 candles burning on the shelf by the window, one for each of my daughters, lit every night for 3 years, because I did not know what else to do with the love I still had for them. "My name is Corvin Ashworth," he said. "I need you to trust me for the next few minutes, and I promise you, that is the hardest part of this whole thing." I should have closed the door. Every instinct I had built over 3 years of loss told me to close the door, to protect what little peace I had scraped together, to not let a stranger's words undo the fragile balance I lived inside. Hope is a dangerous thing when you have already lost it once. It does not knock politely. It kicks the door down and leaves the wreckage behind when it turns out to be wrong. But there was something in his eyes that stopped me. Not kindness exactly. Something closer to recognition, like he had seen what I was carrying and understood the weight of it, because he was carrying something similar. "You should know," I said carefully, "that I have been told many things by many people, soldiers, officials, kind strangers who meant well. None of it brought my daughters back." "I'm not here to tell you something," he said. "I'm here to show you something." He reached into his coat, wincing at the movement, and pulled out a small object wrapped in a strip of cloth. He held it out to me with a steadiness that surprised me, given how his hands had been trembling a moment before. I unwrapped it slowly, my fingers clumsy with a fear I did not want to name. Inside was a small woven bracelet, faded and worn, made of thread the color of dawn light. I had made 2 of these bracelets myself, years ago, before the raid, before the fire, before the soldiers arrived too late to stop what had already been done. I had tied one around each of my daughters' wrists, the morning of their naming day, a tradition passed down through generations of Sorn women, meant to carry a piece of home wherever they went. I had not seen either bracelet since the night everything was taken from me. My knees went weak. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, and Corvin Ashworth stepped forward instinctively, as if to catch me, then stopped himself, giving me the space to steady on my own. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "That's the part that takes longer than a few minutes to explain," he said. "But I think you should hear it sitting down, and I think you should hear all of it before you decide whether to believe me." I looked at the bracelet in my hand. I looked at the 2 candles burning behind me, the ones I lit every night out of habit and hopelessness. I looked at the stranger standing in the rain, bleeding from wounds he had not mentioned, holding a piece of my daughter's history in his coat like it was something worth protecting. I stepped aside and let him in. He moved carefully, favoring his left side, and I noticed for the first time just how exhausted he truly was. Not the ordinary tiredness of a long journey, but something deeper, the kind that settles into a person after they have pushed their body past every reasonable limit and kept going anyway. "You're hurt," I said. "I've been worse," he said, which was not an answer, but I decided not to press him yet. I brought him water and a chair near the small fire I kept burning in the evenings, and he sat with the stiffness of someone whose ribs did not appreciate the movement. For a long moment neither of us spoke. I simply stared at the bracelet in my hands, running my thumb over threads I had woven myself, memories rising up faster than I could hold them back. "I was not looking for your daughters," Corvin said finally. "I want you to understand that first, because I don't want to give you false comfort. I was hired for something else entirely, a job that had nothing to do with your family or your people. I ended up somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, doing something I wasn't being paid to do, and I found things there that I couldn't walk away from." "What things?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. "A processing facility," he said, "run by people who trade in lives instead of goods. I've seen places like it before. I never get used to it." His jaw tightened. "There was a wall there, in one of the holding areas. People carve things into walls when they've got nothing else. Names, dates, prayers sometimes. I saw a name scratched into the stone that matched an old alert file I'd seen years back, one that never got closed. Valith Sorn's daughters, Illyra and Senna. My breath caught in my chest so hard it hurt. "They were there," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Recently. I don't know how recently," he said, and I could hear the care in how he chose his words, trying not to promise more than he could deliver. "But recently enough that the carving hadn't worn away, and recently enough that another prisoner I spoke with remembered the 2 of them by name. Sisters. Close in age, one who never stopped trying to look after the other, even when there was nothing left to give." Tears were falling down my face before I realized I had started crying. 3 years of candles, 3 years of assuming the worst, 3 years of slowly convincing myself that hope was a luxury I could no longer afford, and here was a stranger with a torn coat and tired eyes telling me my daughters might still exist somewhere in this galaxy, breathing, remembering their own names, remembering me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why not simply report it to the authorities and let them handle it?" Something hardened in his expression, just for a moment, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. "Because I've watched authorities sit on reports like this for months, while people disappear further into the system. Because paperwork doesn't move fast enough for the people still waiting inside those walls. And because," he paused, choosing his next words with visible effort, "I know what it's like to lose a sister and never get an answer. I'm not going to let that happen to someone else if I can help it." I studied him then, really studied him, past the exhaustion and the blood and the stranger's face I had never seen before tonight. There was something underneath all of it, something that had nothing to do with payment or duty, a debt he was paying to someone who could no longer collect it. "You want me to come with you?" I said slowly. "I want you to have the choice," he said. "I could go back in alone and try to bring them out myself, but facilities like that are heavily guarded, and I would be moving blind without someone who can identify them the moment we find them. There won't be time to ask questions once we're inside. I need you to be ready to recognize your own daughters in an instant, because we may only get one chance before everything falls apart around us." I thought of every soldier who had told me not to hope. I thought of every year that had passed with silence, where my daughters' voices should have been. I thought of the candles burning on my shelf, worn down to habit rather than belief. And I thought of the bracelet in my hand, still warm from his coat, still smelling faintly of somewhere far from home. "When do we leave?" I asked. Corvin Ashworth allowed himself the smallest, tiredest smile I had ever seen on another being's face. "As soon as you're ready," he said, "because where we're going, hesitation gets people killed, and I don't intend to lose anyone else tonight." I looked at the bracelet one final time, then closed my fingers around it and rose to my feet, the ache of 3 years of waiting finally finding somewhere to go. "I have been ready for 3 years," I said. "Take me to my daughters." Outside, the rain had not stopped, but for the first time since the fire that took my world apart, I no longer felt like I was standing still inside it. I was moving again, towards something instead of away from everything, and whatever waited for me at the end of this stranger's promise, I intended to meet it standing. The ship Corvin Ashworth flew was smaller than I expected, patched together with parts that clearly came from 3 or 4 different manufacturers, and it smelled of engine oil and old coffee. I strapped myself into the seat beside the pilot's chair, while he ran through a series of checks with the practiced speed of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, wincing occasionally when his ribs protested the movement. "You should let me look at that," I said, nodding toward his side. "It'll hold," he said, which was becoming a familiar answer from him, one that told me he had learned long ago not to complain about pain that did not stop him from working. We lifted off from the small landing strip near my settlement, and I watched my home shrink beneath us until it was nothing but a scattering of lights against the dark curve of the planet. I had not left this world in 3 years. I had told myself there was nothing left out there for me. Now I was flying toward the very edges of known space, with a stranger who bled quietly and spoke carefully, chasing a thread of hope, thinner than the bracelet still clutched in my hand. "Tell me about your sister," I said, once we had settled into the long, empty stretch of travel between stars. Corvin did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the controls, though I suspected the ship needed little attention at this point in the journey, and he was simply giving himself time to decide how much to share. "Her name was Marin," he said finally. "Younger than me by 4 years. We grew up on one of the outer colonies, back when Earth was still figuring out how to talk to people like your kind without causing an incident every other week." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "She was taken during a raid. When she was 17, I was away on deployment. By the time I got back, there was nothing left of our home but silence and questions nobody could answer. I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it with the particular weight of someone who understood exactly what those words cost to say and to hear. "I spent years looking," he continued, "chasing rumors, following leads that went nowhere. Eventually I had to accept that some doors don't open again, no matter how hard you knock." He glanced at me, and something in his gaze softened. "But I never stopped noticing when other people were living through the same thing, and I decided a long time ago that if I couldn't get my own answer, I'd at least try to get someone else theirs." I turned the bracelet over in my hands, thinking of my daughters' faces the morning I tied these threads around their wrists, back when the worst thing I imagined for their future was an ordinary disappointment, nothing like the horror that had actually found them. "Illyra was the older one," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came, as if I had been waiting years for someone willing to listen. "She was serious, even as a child, always the one making sure her sister ate before she did, always the one standing guard at the door during storms, so Senna wouldn't be frightened. Senna was different, brighter, louder, always singing something even when there was nothing to sing about. They balanced each other. They sound like they'd have made a good team, wherever they ended up," Corvin said quietly. "I hope so," I said. "I hope whatever they have faced, they faced it together." We flew in silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that does not need filling, the kind 2 people share when they have both lost something and recognize the shape of that loss in each other, without needing to explain it further. Eventually Corvin pulled up a display between us, a star map marked with a cluster of coordinates near the edge of a system I did not recognize. "This is where the facility is," he said, tracing a finger along a route that wound through several checkpoints and open stretches of space. "It's not officially on any registry. The kind of people who run places like this Prefer to stay invisible to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. How do you know it's still there? I asked. How do you know they haven't moved everyone already? I don't. Not for certain, he admitted. But places like this don't relocate quickly. Moving prisoners in bulk draws attention, and attention is the one thing these operations can't survive. If they were still there 3 days ago when I left, there's a strong chance they're still there now. 3 days. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. What happens when we arrive? I asked. Corvin's expression grew more serious, the exhaustion in his eyes sharpening into something more focused, more alert. We won't be able to walk in through the front. The facility is guarded, and the people running it don't take kindly to visitors who ask questions. I have a contact who owes me a favor, someone who can get us through a service entrance used for supply deliveries. From there, we'll have a narrow window to move through the lower levels without being noticed. And if we are noticed, then things get considerably more difficult, he said simply, and I appreciated that he did not try to soften the truth for my comfort. I won't lie to you, Valith. This isn't going to be easy, but I've done difficult work like this before, and I don't intend for this to be the one that goes wrong. I nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead settle over me, heavier than the grief I had carried for 3 years, but somehow easier to bear, because grief had never given me anything to do except wait, and this gave me a direction to move in. We stopped briefly at a small trading post along the way, a cluster of docked ships and makeshift market stalls built into the hollowed interior of an asteroid, where Corvin said he needed to gather a few supplies and check in with the contact who would help us through the facility's service entrance. The moment we stepped off the ship, I understood a little more about the reputation humans carried across the galaxy. People noticed him immediately, some with wary respect, others with the kind of caution reserved for those who might cause trouble without meaning to. A vendor selling repair parts nodded at him like an old acquaintance. A pair of guards near the docking bay watched him pass with the alertness of people who remembered a past encounter they would rather not repeat. "You've been here before," I said. "A few times," he said. "Not always under the best circumstances." We found his contact in a narrow storage bay near the edge of the trading post, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya Callahan, who greeted Corvin with a mixture of familiarity and exasperation that suggested a long history between them. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting. "Good to see you too," Corvin replied. "You said you needed passage codes for a supply route into the lower levels of a certain facility," Priya said, glancing briefly at me before returning her attention to him. "You didn't mention you'd be bringing company." "She has a reason to be here," Corvin said. "A good one." Priya studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, softening slightly, as if she recognized something in my face that answered a question she had not asked aloud. "Family," she said quietly. "2 daughters," I said, "taken 3 years ago." Priya was silent for a moment, then reached beneath the counter and produced a small data chip, sliding it across to Corvin without further comment. "These codes are only good for the next 6 hours," she said. "After that, the rotation changes, and you'll be locked out until the next cycle, which won't be for another 2 days. If you're going, you go now." "That's the plan," Corvin said, pocketing the chip. "And Corvin," Priya added, her tone growing more serious, "whatever you find in there, be careful. I've heard things about that place lately, people going in and orders coming from higher up than usual. Something's changed." "I'll be careful," Corvin said, though I noticed he did not sound entirely convinced of his own promise. We left the trading post with the 6-hour window already ticking down, and as we boarded the ship again, I found myself gripping the bracelet tighter than before, as if the threads themselves could steady the sudden tremor of nerves running through me. "What did she mean?" I asked, once we were back in the air. "About something changing?" "I'm not sure," Corvin admitted. "But if orders are coming from higher up than usual, it could mean the facility is under new pressure to move faster, process prisoners faster, or relocate faster. None of those possibilities are good news for us." "Do you think we'll still have time?" I asked, the fear in my voice impossible to hide now. Corvin glanced at me, and for the first time since he had appeared at my door in the rain, I saw something beyond exhaustion in his eyes. I saw determination, the kind that does not bend easily under pressure. "We're going to make time," he said. "I didn't come this far to walk away with nothing, and neither did you." The ship pushed forward through the dark, carrying us closer to the edge of the system where the facility waited, hidden and guarded, holding within it the answer to 3 years of unanswered prayers. I watched the stars blur past the viewport and thought of 2 candles burning back home, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I allowed myself to imagine blowing them out, not because hope had failed again, but because it had finally been answered. "Tell me what to expect," I said, turning to Corvin with new resolve hardening inside me. "Tell me everything, so that when we reach them, I don't hesitate for even a second." He nodded, and for the remainder of the journey, he walked me through every detail he could offer, the layout of the lower levels as he remembered them, the patterns of the guards, the signals we would need to watch for, the routes we would use if things went wrong. I listened to every word as if my daughters' lives depended on my memory alone, because in some very real way, they did. By the time the facility's cold, distant shape appeared on the horizon of the viewport, a squat structure built into the side of a barren moon, lit by rows of harsh floodlights, I felt something inside me that I had not felt in 3 years. Not just hope, readiness. Corvin brought the ship down behind a ridge of broken rock half a mile from the facility, cutting the engines low enough that the sound would not carry across the open ground between us and the floodlights. The moon's surface was gray and lifeless, scattered with debris from old landings, and the cold outside pressed against the hull like something alive, patient, waiting for us to step into it. "From here we walk," Corvin said, checking a small device strapped to his wrist, the one Priya's data chip now fed information into. "The service entrance is on the eastern side, away from the main guard rotation. If the timing holds, we'll have a 12-minute gap before the next patrol crosses that section." "And if the timing doesn't hold?" I asked. "Then we improvise," he said, and something about the way he said it, calm and matter-of-fact, told me this was not the first time he had needed to improvise his way out of trouble. He handed me a thick outer layer to wear against the cold, along with a small device clipped to my collar that would let us communicate without raising our voices. His hands moved with quick efficiency, checking straps and seals, and despite the wound at his side that I knew was still troubling him, there was no hesitation in anything he did. "Stay close to me," he said. "Move when I move, stop when I stop. If I tell you to get down, you get down without asking why. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of the fear and determination now fighting for space inside my chest. We left the ship and crossed the open ground at a low, careful pace, the floodlights sweeping across the horizon in slow mechanical arcs that we timed our movements around. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I was certain it would give us away before we ever reached the walls, but Corvin moved with a quiet confidence that steadied me, guiding me around debris and into shadow, with barely a word exchanged between us. The eastern side of the facility was quieter than I expected, a narrow service door set into the rock itself, guarded by nothing more than an old keypad and a single dim light overhead. Corvin knelt in front of it, pulling a small tool from his coat and working quickly at the panel, while I kept watch behind us, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "Almost there," he murmured, more to himself than to me. The panel clicked, and the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow corridor lit by pale strips running along the ceiling. The air inside was warmer, tinged with the smell of machinery and something sterile underneath it, the kind of smell that made my skin prickle with unease. "This way," Corvin whispered, stepping through first, weapon drawn but held low, his body angled to shield me from whatever might be waiting around the first corner. We moved through the corridor in near silence, passing storage rooms and maintenance panels, following the route Corvin had memorized from his earlier visit. Every few steps, he paused to listen, holding up a hand to stop me before continuing forward. I had never known fear like this before, not even during the raid 3 years ago, because that fear had come without warning, without time to think. This fear was slow, deliberate, stretched thin over every careful step we took deeper into the unknown. We reached a junction where the corridor split into 2 directions, and Corvin crouched low, studying a small display on his wrist device. "The holding areas should be down this way," he said, nodding toward the left passage. "But there's something wrong. There's more activity on the lower levels than there should be at this hour." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means Priya's contact wasn't exaggerating," he said grimly. "Something's happening here tonight. We need to move faster than I planned." We pressed forward, faster now, footsteps careful but urgent, until the corridor opened into a wider space, a kind of processing hall lined with rows of holding cells, dim and quiet, most of them empty, a few still occupied by shapes I could not clearly make out in the low light. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the cells, searching every shadow, every huddled form for any sign of my daughters. Corvin kept close beside me, his eyes moving constantly, alert to every possible threat, but I could see him watching me too, giving me the moment I needed to search without rushing me. "They're not here," I whispered, after we had passed the length of the hall without a single familiar face among the prisoners. "There's a lower level," Corvin said, checking his device again. "According to the layout I remember, that's where they keep prisoners scheduled for transfer. If there's increased activity tonight, that's likely where it's happening." We found the stairwell down at the far end of the hall, narrow and poorly lit, and as we descended, the sound of voices grew louder ahead of us, sharp commands and the metallic clatter of equipment being moved. Corvin held up a hand, stopping me at the base of the stairs, and peered carefully around the corner into the space beyond. "Guards," he whispered, "4 that I can see, moving prisoners toward a loading area. We need another way around." My chest tightened with a fear sharper than anything before it. If prisoners were being moved tonight, if the facility was preparing for some kind of transfer, then every second we spent finding another route was a second that might carry my daughters further away from us. "There isn't time for another way around," I said, my voice low but firm. "If they are among those being moved, we lose them the moment that transfer leaves this place." Corvin's jaw tightened, and I could see him weighing the risk, calculating odds I could not begin to understand, the kind of quick, practical thinking that came from years of experience I had never had to develop myself. "Stay behind me," he said finally, "and stay low. If this goes wrong, you run back the way we came, and you do not stop for anything." "I'm not leaving without them," I said. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I need you to promise me you'll run if I tell you to." I hesitated, every instinct in me rebelling against the idea of leaving this place without my daughters, but I saw something in his eyes that demanded honesty, not bravado, and I gave a single, reluctant nod. "I promise," I said. He moved forward, quick and low, and I followed as closely as I could, my heart hammering as we crossed into the loading area, a wide, open space with a high ceiling and rows of transport containers lined up near a large door leading out to a docking bay beyond. Guards moved among a small group of prisoners, checking restraints, calling out instructions in clipped, impatient voices. I scanned the group desperately, searching every face for the ones I had carried in my memory for 3 long years, and then my eyes found her. Illyra, older now, thinner, her face marked by exhaustion and hardship I could not begin to imagine, but unmistakably her, standing tall despite everything, one arm wrapped protectively around a smaller figure beside her. Senna, my daughters, both of them, alive, standing together exactly as I had always hoped they would be, even in the depths of whatever horror they had endured, holding on to each other the way they always had. A sound escaped me before I could stop it, something between a sob and a gasp, and Corvin's hand shot out instantly, gripping my arm, pulling me back into the shadow of a nearby container before the sound could carry. "I see them," he whispered urgently. "I see them, Valeth. But you have to stay quiet. If the guards notice us now, we lose any chance of getting them out safely." I forced myself to breathe, forced the desperate, aching need to run toward them back down into something I could control, though every part of me screamed to close the distance between us immediately. "What do we do?" I whispered. Corvin studied the layout of the room, counting guards, tracking movement, his mind clearly working through a dozen possibilities at once. "There's a control panel near the loading door," he said finally. "If I can disable the security locks on that side, it'll trigger an alarm across the lower levels, which will pull most of the guards away from this room to respond. It'll create chaos, but it'll also create an opening. And in that opening, we move fast, we get to your daughters, and we get out through the corridor we came in, before anyone realizes what happened," he said. "It's not a clean plan, but it's the only one we have time for." "Then let's do it," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, steadied by the sight of my daughters, standing only a short distance away, closer than they had been in 3 long years. Corvin moved along the edge of the room, staying low, using the containers as cover, while I remained crouched in the shadows, watching my daughters, with an intensity that made the weight feel unbearable. I saw Senna glance nervously toward the loading door, saw Alira squeeze her sister's hand in quiet reassurance, and something in that small gesture nearly broke me apart with relief. They were still themselves. Whatever they had survived it together, and they had survived it as sisters who had not stopped protecting each other. A sharp beep sounded from across the room, followed almost instantly by a blaring alarm that echoed through the loading area, red lights flashing along the walls. Guards spun toward the sound, shouting orders, and within seconds most of them were moving away from the prisoners, converging toward the source of the disturbance near the control panel. "Now," Corvin said, appearing suddenly at my side again, breathing hard but focused. "Move now, Valith." We crossed the room quickly, weaving between containers, and I felt every second stretch impossibly long as we closed the distance toward the small group of remaining prisoners. A single guard remained near them, distracted by the alarm, his attention split between the chaos across the room and the prisoners in front of him. Corvin moved first, quick and precise, closing the distance and subduing the guard before he could raise any alarm of his own, and then the path was clear, and I was running, finally running toward my daughters after 3 years of standing still. "Alira," I called, my voice breaking on her name. "Senna." Both of them turned at the sound of my voice, and I watched disbelief wash over their faces. The same disbelief I imagined had been written across my own only hours earlier when Corvin first appeared at my door. "Mother," Alira breathed, her voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper, as if she could not fully believe the word leaving her own mouth. I reached them and pulled them both into my arms, holding them so tightly I feared I might never let go, feeling the reality of their presence against me after 3 years of only memory and grief to hold on to. Senna was crying, great heaving sobs into my shoulder, and Alira's arms wrapped around us both, trembling with an emotion too large for words. "We have to move," Corvin's voice cut through the moment, urgent but not unkind, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of returning guards. "The alarm won't hold their attention forever." I pulled back just enough to look at my daughters' faces, memorizing every detail as if I might lose them again the moment I looked away, and then nodded, forcing myself back into the urgency of the moment. "We're going home," I told them. "Both of you, right now." We moved together toward the corridor we had entered through, Corvin leading the way, checking every corner before allowing us to pass, my daughters close beside me, their hands gripping mine as though letting go might undo everything that had just happened. Behind us, the alarm continued to blare, and shouted voices echoed distantly through the facility, but ahead of us, the corridor remained clear, leading back toward the service entrance and the ship waiting beyond it. We were almost to the door when a voice called out behind us, sharp and commanding, followed by the heavy sound of boots against metal flooring, and I felt my heart drop as I realized our escape had not gone as unnoticed as we had hoped. Corvin turned instantly, pushing my daughters and me behind him with one arm, while raising his weapon toward the sound with the other. 2 guards rounded the corner behind us, weapons already drawn, shouting orders for us to stop where we stood. "Get them to the door," Corvin said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "I'll hold them here." "I'm not leaving you," I said. "You made me a promise," he reminded me, not taking his eyes off the guards advancing toward us. "This is exactly the moment I need you to keep it. Get Illyra and Senna to the ship. I'll catch up." Every instinct in me rebelled against the idea of leaving him behind, but I saw the same fierce determination in his eyes that I had seen back in my doorway hours ago, the look of someone who had already decided what he was willing to risk tonight, and I understood that arguing would only cost precious seconds neither of us could afford. "Come with us," I said instead, one final plea. "I will," he said. "Now go." I grabbed Illyra and Senna's hands and pulled them toward the service door, my heart pounding with fear for Corvin, even as relief for my daughters flooded through me in equal measure. Behind us, I heard the guards' voices grow louder, followed by the sharp, controlled sound of Corvin's weapon, precise and economical, clearing the path he needed to buy us time. "Mother, wait," Senna gasped as we ran, her voice thin with exhaustion. "He can't hold them alone." "He asked us to trust him," I said, though my own voice trembled with doubt. "We have to trust him." We reached the service door and burst through into the cold night air, the floodlights sweeping across the open ground exactly as they had when we first arrived, and I pulled my daughters toward the ridge of rock where Corvin's ship waited hidden from view. Illyra stumbled once, weakened by months, perhaps years, of hardship I could not begin to understand, and I caught her, steadying her against my side, refusing to let go, even as we pushed forward across the uneven ground. Behind us, the sound of the alarm still echoed faintly from within the facility, and I glanced back repeatedly, searching the darkness for any sign of Corvin emerging from the door we had just passed through. "There," Senna said suddenly, pointing back toward the facility. A figure burst through the service entrance, moving fast despite an obvious limp, and I recognized Corvin's silhouette even in the dim light, one arm pressed against his side where I knew his old wound had likely been reopened by whatever had happened in that corridor. He crossed the open ground toward us at a hard run, glancing back over his shoulder every few strides. "Go, go," he shouted as he closed the distance. "They'll have reinforcements coming any minute." We reached the ship together, and Corvin practically shoved us up the ramp before following close behind, sealing the hatch the moment we were all inside. He collapsed briefly against the wall of the cargo hold, breathing hard, blood visible now along his side where his earlier wound had clearly worsened. "You're hurt," I said again, this time with far more urgency than before. "I'll live," he said, pushing himself upright with visible effort. "But we need to get out of here before that changes." He moved to the cockpit, and I helped Illyra and Senna settle into the seats behind him, wrapping them both in the warm layers stored beneath the bench, watching their faces with a hunger for detail that 3 years of absence had left in me. They were thinner than I remembered, marked by scars I did not yet understand, but they were alive, and they were together, and for now, that was enough to hold on to. The ship shuddered as Corvin pushed the engines to full power, lifting us away from the moon's surface just as lights appeared near the facility's main entrance, other ships beginning to stir in response to the alarm we had triggered. "Hold on," Corvin called back. "This part might get a little rough." The ship banked hard, and through the viewport I caught a glimpse of pursuit vessels rising from the facility's docking bay, sleek and fast, closing the distance behind us far quicker than I found comfortable. Corvin's hands moved across the controls with practiced urgency, weaving the ship through a field of scattered debris left over from old wreckage near the moon's orbit, using the chaos of broken metal and rock as cover against the pursuing ships. "They're gaining," I said, watching the display behind him. "I know," he said, jaw tight with concentration. "There's a jump point about 2 minutes out. If we can reach it before they close the distance, we'll be clear." 2 minutes felt like an eternity, As the ship rattled and lurched through the debris field, Corvin's hand steady, despite the visible pain each sharp movement cost him. Elira gripped my hand tightly beside me, and Senna pressed close against my other side, both of them silent with the particular kind of fear that comes from having survived captivity, only to find themselves in the middle of another desperate escape. "We're almost there," Corvin called back. A moment later, the ship gave a final, sharp lurch, and the stars outside blurred into streaks of light as we crossed into the jump, the pursuing ships falling away behind us, unable to follow through the narrow window Corvin had found. For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the engines settling into the smoother rhythm of open travel, carrying us safely away from the facility and everything it represented. "We made it," Senna whispered finally, as if she could not quite believe the words even as she said them. "We made it," I echoed, pulling both my daughters closer, tears finally falling freely, now that the danger had passed. Corvin eased back from the controls once the ship settled into a stable course, and I saw him press a hand against his side again, his face pale with the strain of the last hour finally catching up with him. "Let me see it," I said, moving to kneel beside him despite his attempt to wave me off. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. I pulled back his coat carefully and found the wound along his ribs deeper than I had realized, reopened during whatever confrontation had taken place in that corridor, blood soaking through the fabric beneath. Elira, despite her own exhaustion, moved to help me without hesitation, tearing strips of cloth from a supply kit stored beneath the bench and working quickly to clean and bind the wound with a steadiness that spoke of skills she had clearly been forced to learn during her time in captivity. "You've done this before," Corvin said, wincing as she worked. "More times than I would like," Elira said quietly, and something in the way she said it told me there were stories inside her now that would take far longer than tonight to fully surface, stories I would need to be patient enough to receive whenever she was ready to share them. "Thank you," Corvin said, once the wound was bound. "Thank you," Elira replied, meeting his eyes with a seriousness that mirrored the same quality I remembered from her as a child, "for coming for us." "I wasn't looking for you specifically," Corvin admitted. "Not at first, but once I found your names, I couldn't walk away." Senna, who had been quiet for much of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Why would a stranger risk so much for people he'd never met?" Corvin considered the question for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if searching for the right way to answer something he had clearly wrestled with many times before. "Because somebody once did the same for someone I loved, and it came too late," he said finally. "I couldn't fix what happened to my sister, but I could make sure the next family who lost someone didn't have to wait as long as I did for an answer." The cabin fell quiet after that, the weight of his words settling over all of us, and I found myself studying this stranger, who had walked into my grief only hours ago, and walked out again carrying my entire world in his hands. "You said you weren't looking for us specifically," I said slowly. "What were you looking for, before you found that wall?" Corvin's expression grew distant again, and for a moment I thought he might not answer, but eventually he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "A shipment. Stolen cargo, nothing more complicated than that. It was supposed to be a simple job. I never expected to walk into something like what I found in there." "And yet you stayed," I said. "You could have reported it and moved on with your original work." "I could have," he agreed. "But some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. I made a choice, and I'd make the same one again." Elira watched him carefully throughout this exchange, and I saw something shift in her expression, the wary suspicion she had carried since we first boarded the ship, softening slightly into something closer to trust. "Where are we going now?" Senna asked, breaking the heavy silence with a question that felt, for the first time in a long while, hopeful rather than frightened. "Home," I said, before Corvin could answer. "We're going home." Corvin nodded, setting the ship's course toward the familiar stretch of stars that would lead us back to the small settlement I had left only a day earlier, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. As the ship settled into the long journey ahead, Illyra rested her head against my shoulder, and Senna curled up on my other side, both of them finally allowing themselves the exhausted sleep of people who no longer needed to stay alert against constant threat. I stayed awake long after they drifted off, watching the stars pass slowly beyond the viewport, thinking of the 2 candles waiting on my shelf back home, and the third one I now intended to light for the stranger who had refused to let their flames go out. The settlement looked exactly as I had left it, small and quiet, beneath a pale morning sky, and yet everything about it felt different as the ship descended toward the landing strip near my home. I had left this place carrying nothing but grief and a stranger's promise. I was returning with my daughters beside me, and something in the very air seemed to recognize the change, though I knew that was simply my own heart reshaping the world around it. Illyra and Senna stepped off the ship slowly, blinking against the morning light, taking in the sight of the small house and the surrounding hills with expressions I could not fully read, somewhere between relief and disbelief, and something rawer underneath both. I understood that returning home after everything they had endured would not feel simple, no matter how much I wished it could. "It's still here," Senna said quietly, staring at the house. "I never stopped keeping it ready for you," I said, my voice thick with emotion I no longer tried to hide. Corvin followed behind us at a slower pace, still favoring his side, though he waved off my concern each time I glanced back at him. Inside the house, little had changed. The same 2 candles sat on the shelf by the window, burned low from the previous night's lighting, and I saw both my daughters notice them at the same moment, their eyes meeting mine with a question neither of them asked aloud. "I lit one for each of you," I said simply. "Every night, for 3 years." Illyra crossed the room and touched the candles gently, her fingers trembling slightly, and I saw tears finally slip down her face, the first real break in the composed steadiness she had carried since the moment I found her in that facility. "We used to talk about you," she said softly. "Senna and I, we told each other you would never stop looking, even when everyone else told us to give up hoping you would." "I never gave up," I said. "Not really. I just didn't know how to keep hoping without breaking apart. But I never stopped loving you both, not for a single day." Senna joined her sister at the shelf, and for a long moment the 2 of them stood together in front of the candles, silent, absorbing the reality of a home that had waited for them exactly as they had imagined it during the darkest days of their captivity. Corvin remained near the doorway, giving us the space to have this moment, though I noticed the exhaustion finally catching up with him, his shoulders sagging slightly against the frame. "You should sit down before you fall down," I told him. "I've had worse days," he said, though he accepted the chair I offered without further argument this time. Over the following hours, as the sun rose fully over the settlement, I prepared food for all of us, more out of habit than appetite, though my daughters ate with a hunger that told me clearly enough how long it had been since either of them had eaten a proper meal without fear attached to it. Corvin ate quietly, watching the 3 of us with an expression I found difficult to fully interpret, something between satisfaction and a deeper, more private ache that I suspected had little to do with his physical wounds. "Will you stay?" I asked him, once the meal was finished and the house had settled into a quieter, calmer rhythm, "at least until you've healed properly." "I don't want to intrude," he said. "This is your time with them, not mine to share." "You brought them home," I said. "You are already part of this, whether you intended to be or not." He was quiet for a moment, glancing toward Illyra and Senna, who had curled up together on a low bench near the window, finally allowing themselves the deep, uninterrupted rest that safety makes possible. "I've spent a long time doing this kind of work alone," he admitted, moving from one job to the next, never staying anywhere long enough to see how the story ends. "I'm not entirely sure how to sit still in the aftermath." "Then let this be the place where you learn," I said. He allowed himself another rare smile, tired but genuine, and something in his posture eased slightly, as if a burden he had carried for a long time had finally set down some of its weight. Over the following days, I watched my daughters slowly settle back into a life they had once known, though not without difficulty. Senna startled easily at loud noises, flinching at sounds that would have meant nothing to her before her captivity. Elira kept careful watch over both her sister and me, as if the habit of protecting others had become so deeply ingrained in her that she could not simply set it aside now that the immediate danger had passed. I did not push either of them to speak about what they had endured before they were ready. I simply stayed close, present, patient, the way I wished I could have been for every single day they had been gone. Corvin remained with us longer than he perhaps intended, his wound healing slowly under Elira's careful attention, the two of them developing an easy, quiet rapport built on the shared understanding of hardship survived. He told stories, when asked, of other jobs, other journeys, carefully avoiding the darker details, but offering enough to paint a picture of a life spent constantly moving, constantly searching for the next problem worth solving. "Why do you keep doing this?" I asked him one evening, as we sat together outside the house, watching the sun set over the hills. "Risking yourself for people who owe you nothing in return." He considered the question for a long time before answering, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Because the alternative is doing nothing," he said finally, "and I've seen what doing nothing costs people. I couldn't save my sister, but every time I help someone else find their way back to the people who love them, it feels like paying down a debt I can never fully clear. It doesn't erase what happened to Marin. Nothing will. But it makes the loss feel less like it was for nothing. You've given so much of yourself to strangers," I said. "Don't you ever want something for yourself in return?" He glanced at me, something unguarded flickering across his expression before he looked away again. "I think," he said slowly, "that watching your daughters sleep safely in that house tonight is more than enough payment for anything I did to get them here." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply reached over and rested my hand briefly on his, a gesture of gratitude too large for words to properly carry. The following morning, Corvin told me it was time for him to leave. His wound had healed enough to travel safely, and I could see in his eyes the familiar restlessness of someone who had never learned how to stay still for long, no matter how much peace a place might offer him. "You don't have to go," I said, though I understood even as I said it that the offer was more for my own comfort than a realistic expectation of what he needed. "I do, though," he said gently. "There are other people out there, other families waiting for answers they don't know are coming. I can't help them if I stay here." Elira and Senna joined us at the doorway as he prepared to leave, both of them looking healthier than they had upon our arrival, though I knew the deeper healing would take far longer than a few days of rest and safety could provide. "Thank you," Elira said, extending her hand to him with a formality that softened into something warmer as he took it. "For everything." "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me help," he replied. Senna, uncharacteristically shy, simply hugged him briefly before stepping back, her eyes shining with unspoken gratitude that needed no further words to convey. I walked him to his ship alone, the morning air cool and quiet around us, the settlement slowly waking to another ordinary day that no longer felt ordinary to me at all. "I don't know how to properly thank you for what you did," I said, as we reached the edge of the landing strip. "You already have," he said. "Every moment I watched you with your daughters these past few days, that was thanks enough." "Will we see you again?" I asked. "I hope so," he said, and something in the honesty of his answer told me it was not simply a polite farewell, but a genuine wish. I don't often get to see how these stories end. I'd like to come back one day and see how yours continues. "Then promise me you will," I said, "not because you owe us anything more, but because we would like you to." He nodded, a slow, sincere gesture that carried more weight than any spoken promise could have offered. "I promise," he said. I watched his ship lift off from the landing strip and disappear into the pale morning sky, carrying him toward whatever next task or unanswered debt called him forward, and I stood there long after he had vanished from sight, holding on to the quiet, unfamiliar feeling of a hope that had actually been fulfilled. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I gathered my daughters near the shelf by the window where the 2 candles still burned, worn down now to their final inches after 3 years of nightly lighting. "I think it's time we let these finish burning," I said softly, and Illyra and Senna nodded, understanding without needing further explanation that these particular candles, lit in grief and desperate hope, had finally served their purpose. We watched together as the flames flickered low and finally went out, the small room falling briefly into shadow before I reached for a fresh candle and struck a new flame to replace them. "This one is different," I told my daughters, setting the new candle carefully in the space where the old ones had stood. "This one isn't for loss. This one is for the stranger who refused to let hope die, even when the rest of the world had already decided it should." Senna leaned against my shoulder, watching the new flame settle into a steady, gentle glow. "Do you think he'll really come back?" she asked. "I believe he will," I said, "because I've learned something about humans these past few days that I never fully understood before. They carry their debts differently than we do. They don't simply pay them and move on. They carry them like promises, and they keep returning to make sure those promises hold." Illyra was quiet for a moment, staring at the small flame flickering steadily in the evening light. "I used to think humans were dangerous," she said eventually. "Reckless, frightening even. That's what we were taught to believe, back before all of this happened." "And now?" I asked. "Now I think," she said slowly, "that maybe the most dangerous thing about them is how far they're willing to go for people who aren't even their own." I wrapped my arms around both my daughters, pulling them close against me in the soft glow of the new candle, feeling for the first time in 3 years that the empty space inside our small home had finally been filled again, not simply by their return, but by the quiet, unshakable proof that somewhere out in the vast, indifferent dark of the galaxy there existed people willing to fight against hopelessness itself, simply because they had once known what it meant to lose everything, and had decided, against all reasonable expectation, that no one else should have to carry that same weight alone. Outside, the stars began to appear over the settlement, scattered and endless, and somewhere among them, I knew, a battered ship carried a tired, scarred stranger toward his next unfinished debt, chasing down another family's silence with the same stubborn refusal to accept an ending that had once brought my daughters back to me. I did not know if I would ever see Corvin Ashworth again, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep and warm inside my chest, that wherever he went next, he would carry a piece of our story with him, the way he clearly carried every story he had ever touched, and that somewhere in the vast unknown reaches of space, another mother, another family, another empty hearth was waiting for the same impossible gift he had once brought to mine. The third candle burned steadily through the night, and for the first time in 3 long years, I slept without grief pressing against my chest, my daughters safe beside me, and my heart, at last, quiet.